I learned a long time ago that the most dangerous words anyone can say are, "Don't worry, it's already been approved." That sentence changed my life before breakfast on a quiet Tuesday morning. I own 180 acres of farmland that my family has worked for 4 generations just outside a growing suburban neighborhood. Every fence line, every oak tree, and every inch of the gravel road leading to my barn has a story behind it. That road has never belonged to anyone except my family, which is why I nearly dropped my coffee when I saw a steady stream of SUVs, delivery trucks, and commuter cars driving straight across my property as if it were the main entrance to a shopping center. At first I honestly believed there had been an accident on the county highway, so I pulled my pickup onto the shoulder and watched. The traffic never slowed down. Drivers followed one another with complete confidence, passing my equipment shed, kicking up clouds of dust, and leaving fresh tire tracks across ground that had been quiet only the night before. Then I noticed something that made even less sense. Brand new directional signs had appeared overnight. Bright reflective arrows pointed directly toward my gravel road with the words, "Community Entrance," printed beneath them. I had never seen those signs before, and I certainly hadn't given anyone permission to install them. Instead of confronting the drivers, I reached into my truck, grabbed my phone, and started recording everything. Years of dealing with property lines had taught me that memories fade but evidence doesn't. As I documented each vehicle, one woman rolled down her window to apologize for the dust. She smiled politely and told me the Homeowners Association had informed every resident that this was now the official entrance because it was supposedly faster than using the old access road. Before I could ask another question, she drove away, completely convinced she had every right to be there. That was the moment I realized this wasn't confusion. Someone had planned this. Less than 15 minutes later, a dark blue SUV pulled onto my property, and Rebecca Collins stepped out carrying a leather folder, and wearing the same calm expression I'd seen during county meetings over the years. As president of the Homeowners Association, she walked toward me as though she expected me to thank her. She explained that temporary traffic changes were necessary for the convenience of the neighborhood, while improvements were being made elsewhere. When I asked who had authorized using my private road, she simply tapped the folder and replied that everything had been handled properly. She never showed me a single document. She never mentioned my name or my family's ownership. She acted as though the decision had already become permanent simply because enough people believed it had. I didn't argue. I kept recording. The more confident she sounded, the more certain I became that something wasn't right. After she left, I walked the entire length of the road and discovered fresh survey paint near the tree line along with wooden stakes that certainly hadn't been there the previous evening. Someone had spent hours preparing this without ever contacting me. By sunset I had collected photographs, videos, timestamps, and statements from several drivers who all repeated the same story. They had been told the Homeowners Association had legal approval. But approval from whom? As I spread my evidence across my kitchen table that night, my phone rang. The caller identified himself as a clerk from the county records office, and before I could explain why I intended to visit in the morning, he quietly asked one question that sent a chill through me. "Mr. Harper, can you tell me why your property file was requested yesterday by someone who never signed their real name?" I arrived at the county records office the next morning 15 minutes before it opened, and the clerk who had called me the night before was already waiting by the front entrance with a nervous look that immediately told me this was bigger than a simple misunderstanding. He introduced himself as Michael Jensen and quietly explained that he should not have called me, but something about the request for my property file had bothered him enough that he felt I deserved to know. He led me into the archive room where rows of steel cabinets held more than a century of land records, survey maps, easements, and property transfers. Instead of pulling only my file, he placed 2 different maps on the table. At first glance they looked identical, but after studying them for a few moments I noticed that one version showed the neighborhood's back entrance connecting through an easement that crossed land beside my farm, while the older version ended that same road nearly 300 feet short of my property line. I looked up at Michael, and he slowly nodded before telling me that both maps existed inside the county system, even though only one of them should have. That was information I never expected to hear. If two official maps disagreed, then somebody had changed something at some point, and nobody had fully explained why. Before I could ask another question, Michael opened my property folder and pointed toward the sign-out sheet attached to the inside cover. Someone had requested copies of my survey history the previous afternoon, but the signature was impossible to identify because only initials had been written. There was no organization listed, no phone number, and no explanation for the request. County policy normally required complete identification. Somehow that requirement had been ignored. Michael admitted that he had already informed his supervisor about the irregularity, but he warned me not to assume anyone had intentionally broken the law because clerical mistakes sometimes happened. Even so, he quietly suggested I request certified copies of every historical survey before anyone had the opportunity to reorganize the files again. I immediately filled out the paperwork. While waiting for the copies to be prepared, I noticed a framed aerial photograph hanging on the wall showing the entire area nearly 20 years earlier. One detail immediately caught my attention. The neighborhood that now depended on the back entrance had not even existed when that photograph was taken, yet my gravel road looked exactly the same as it did today. That confirmed something important. My family's road had never been designed to carry neighborhood traffic. As I stood there studying the photograph, another county employee entered the archive carrying a rolled engineering drawing. He apologized for interrupting and casually mentioned that inspectors had scheduled a full infrastructure review for the subdivision in 10 days because several unrelated complaints had recently been filed. My attention shifted immediately. 10 days was not much time. Whatever was happening would soon be examined by people with authority to verify every measurement and every permit. Before leaving, I collected the certified records and carefully placed them inside a waterproof case. As I walked back toward my truck, my phone vibrated with a neighborhood message that had just been posted online by Rebecca Collins. She proudly announced that the temporary traffic plan would remain in effect until further notice because, according to her statement, every necessary approval had already been confirmed. Attached beneath her announcement was a digital map that did not match either of the county maps I had just seen, and in the lower corner of that image was a handwritten revision date that was newer than any document inside the county archive, making me realize someone else had created an entirely different version of the story. I have always believed that deadlines reveal character faster than arguments ever can, and with only 10 days remaining before the county inspection, every decision suddenly carried more weight than it had the day before. I spread every certified survey, photograph, and map across the large workbench inside my barn, arranging them by date instead of by subject. When I stopped looking at the documents as individual pieces and started treating them like a timeline, a pattern slowly emerged that I had completely missed. The oldest surveys consistently showed the subdivision ending well before my property, but newer drawings gradually shifted small details until the neighborhood's back entrance appeared to connect naturally with the road crossing my farm. Each individual change looked minor, yet together they told a very different story. Instead of guessing, I decided to verify everything myself. I measured distances using the original field notes, copied from the county archive, and compared them with the landmarks that still existed on my property. The old stone culvert, the iron fence corner, and a giant oak tree planted by my grandfather all matched the oldest records almost perfectly. That meant the land itself had never changed. Only the paperwork had. Before I finished my measurements, another unexpected development arrived. A retired neighbor named Thomas Ellis slowly drove onto my property and asked whether I had a few minutes to talk. Thomas had lived in the area long before the subdivision was built, and he rarely involved himself in neighborhood disagreements. This time was different. He quietly told me he remembered construction crews struggling to obtain access during the early stages of development because the planned entrance had encountered permit delays. According to Thomas, temporary construction traffic had once been routed through an unfinished access lane behind the neighborhood, but he had never heard anyone say that route became permanent. That was entirely new information. If his memory was accurate, then the current traffic arrangement had evolved from something originally intended to be temporary. Before leaving, Thomas mentioned one detail that immediately caught my attention. He remembered seeing county engineers placing survey markers near the back entrance years ago, but only once. After that, no additional work had ever been completed there. As soon as he drove away, I compared his recollection with the engineering dates listed in the certified records. The timeline did not fit. Several documents referenced inspections that appeared to occur after the project should have already been finished. Either the paperwork contained unexplained revisions or the project itself had never reached the final stage everyone assumed it had. That afternoon I drove near the neighborhood entrance without interfering with anyone and simply observed. Fresh directional signs remained in place. Volunteers hired by the Homeowners Association greeted drivers with friendly smiles, and everything appeared organized enough to convince residents that the new route was completely legitimate. Rebecca Collins stood nearby speaking confidently with several board members, and from a distance it was obvious she believed the upcoming county inspection would simply confirm everything she had been telling the neighborhood. I returned home before sunset and organized my notes into a single binder because I wanted facts instead of opinions when the inspection arrived. Just as I closed the cover, my telephone rang again. It was Michael from the county records office, and his voice sounded far more serious than before. He told me an engineer reviewing historical infrastructure files had discovered a reference to a missing permit attachment that was supposed to describe the legal status of the neighborhood's back entrance, but the attachment itself had completely disappeared from the archive, and without that single missing document, nobody could honestly say whether the entrance had ever been fully approved at all. I had been chasing missing paperwork for 3 days, but the moment I stopped looking only inside filing cabinets and started asking who had actually been there, the entire story began to shift. With 7 days remaining before the county inspection, I drove to meet the retired county engineer Michael had quietly mentioned over the telephone. His name was Richard Lawson, and he had spent nearly 30 years reviewing subdivision infrastructure before retiring almost a decade earlier. We met on the porch of his modest farmhouse a few miles outside town, where stacks of old engineering journals and survey books still lined the shelves behind him. I expected opinions. Instead, he brought out a weathered storage box labeled with the name of the subdivision now managed by Rebecca Collins. Richard explained that he had kept personal reference notes whenever large developments involved unusual engineering questions because they often became valuable years later. He carefully unfolded an aging field sketch and pointed toward the neighborhood's back entrance. According to his handwritten notes, that entrance had originally been approved only as a temporary construction access route while the permanent entrance awaited additional environmental review. Once the neighborhood opened, the temporary route was supposed to be closed unless several final conditions were satisfied. Richard paused before saying something that immediately changed how I viewed everything. He never remembered signing the final approval because, as far as he knew, the required inspection had never taken place. That was not proof by itself, but it completely changed the direction of my investigation. Instead of asking whether the Homeowners Association had authority to redirect traffic, I now had to ask whether the entrance they depended on had ever become legal in the first place. Richard handed me photocopies of his field notes, and encouraged me to compare the inspection numbers with the county archive because every approved project was supposed to leave a complete paper trail. On my way home I stopped near the back entrance and quietly observed from the public roadside. Fresh landscaping had been installed around decorative stone walls, new directional signs guided vehicles confidently through the entrance, and nothing suggested that the location might have begun as a temporary solution. Rebecca stood with several board members speaking enthusiastically to contractors measuring nearby sidewalks. She appeared completely certain that the county inspection would simply validate everything the neighborhood had been doing. I chose not to interrupt. Evidence was becoming more valuable than conversation. That evening I compared Richard's handwritten inspection numbers with the certified documents I had already collected. One number matched perfectly. Another referred to an inspection report that did not exist anywhere in my copies. Even stranger, the sequence skipped directly to a later project as though an entire file had been removed from the record. I immediately called Michael, who promised to search an older off-site archive the following morning because some historical engineering documents had never been digitized. Before ending the call, he quietly shared one more piece of information that I had not expected. County supervisors had expanded the upcoming inspection beyond simple traffic concerns. Surveyors, infrastructure specialists, and records officials would all be present together because too many inconsistencies had surfaced within the same project. The inspection was no longer routine. As I placed Richard's notes into my growing binder, I realized every new answer uncovered an even larger question, and if the missing inspection report existed somewhere inside the county archives, it could determine whether the neighborhood's entire back entrance had been operating for years without the final approval everyone believed it had. I had expected the county to spend weeks sorting through old paperwork, but the next morning proved that someone inside the records department understood the urgency just as clearly as I did. With only 5 days remaining before the inspection, Michael called before sunrise and asked me to come to the archive immediately because the off-site storage facility had delivered several unopened engineering boxes that had not been reviewed in years. When I arrived, the conference table was covered with aging folders tied together by faded cotton tape, each labeled with project numbers instead of neighborhood names. Michael explained that older infrastructure files had been organized by engineering contracts rather than subdivisions, which was why they had remained hidden from ordinary property searches. Together we carefully worked through the documents one file at a time until an envelope marked with the same inspection number Richard Lawson had written in his personal notes finally appeared. The envelope contained photographs, handwritten field observations, and a draft inspection checklist, but one page immediately stood out. Across the top, in bold capital letters, someone had stamped the words, "Pending final approval." Beneath that stamp, several required inspections had blank signature lines. No completion date had been entered. I felt my entire understanding of the situation change in that instant. Until then I believed the county had simply misplaced a finished record. Instead, it appeared the process itself might never have been completed. Michael carefully compared the draft with the digital record currently stored in the county system. The electronic version listed the project as completed, yet none of the supporting signatures appeared in the physical file. Neither of us rushed to conclusions because incomplete records can sometimes be corrected later through supplemental approvals. Even so, another surprise arrived only minutes later. A senior records supervisor joined us carrying an index ledger from the same year. After checking several entries, she quietly confirmed that no supplemental approval had ever been logged under that inspection number. That single discovery transformed the investigation from a search for missing paperwork into a question about how the project had been marked complete at all. By early afternoon, county administrators decided the upcoming inspection would include a complete review of the subdivision's access history rather than limiting the visit to current traffic conditions. News spread quickly. Residents began asking questions online after noticing county vehicles photographing entrance signs and measuring roadway dimensions. Rebecca Collins responded with another confident announcement assuring homeowners that routine administrative reviews happen all the time and that there was absolutely nothing to worry about. Many residents accepted her explanation without hesitation, but others started comparing old neighborhood newsletters with current maps and noticed details that no longer matched. The confidence that had surrounded the Homeowners Association only days earlier slowly began giving way to uncertainty. I spent the remainder of the afternoon organizing every certified copy, photograph, measurement, and witness statement into chronological order because I wanted county officials to see a complete timeline rather than isolated facts. As sunset approached, Michael called once more with information he had only just received from another department. During a database verification, technicians discovered that the digital completion date attached to the back entrance project had been entered almost 8 years after the original inspection had supposedly concluded, and there was no explanation identifying who entered that date, or what document had been used to justify it. Meaning the most important answer in the entire case was still missing just days before the county inspection was scheduled to begin. I have heard people say that paperwork cannot change the real world, but I watched the opposite happen the morning county officials arrived. Long before sunrise I walked my property one final time, checking every photograph, every survey marker, and every page inside the binder that had grown thicker with each passing day. I was not preparing for an argument. I was preparing to answer questions with facts. By 8 o'clock the first county vehicles rolled into the area, followed by survey trucks, engineering staff, records specialists, and transportation officials. Instead of heading directly toward my farm, they began at the neighborhood's back entrance. From a respectful distance I watched crews unload tripods, measuring equipment, and historical maps while residents gathered quietly along the sidewalks. Rebecca Collins greeted the inspection team with the same confidence she had displayed from the beginning, explaining that the community had cooperated fully and that every necessary approval had already been documented. No one challenged her statement. The inspectors simply thanked her and continued their work. That calm response told me they intended to rely only on evidence. Within the first hour, surveyors compared current measurements with original engineering drawings, while records officials cross-referenced project numbers against certified copies that Michael had prepared earlier in the week. Then something unexpected happened. One of the senior engineers requested the original draft inspection packet that had been discovered inside the off-site archive. As he carefully compared each unsigned checklist with the electronic completion record, he quietly called several colleagues together. They spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing only those documents while the rest of the inspection continued around them. I could not hear their conversation, but I noticed that additional photographs were taken of the back entrance, temporary reference stakes were placed beside the roadway, and fresh measurements were recorded that had not appeared on the original schedule. New information kept changing the direction of the inspection. Around midday Michael approached me with a measured expression and explained that the county had confirmed the digital completion entry could not be linked to any supporting approval document currently stored in the official archive. That did not automatically invalidate the entrance, but it meant the county could no longer rely on the electronic record alone. A complete legal review would now be required before any permanent conclusion could be reached. Even more surprising, transportation officials informed the inspection team that because the legal status of the entrance had become uncertain, traffic routing through my private road could not continue while the review remained active. Within the hour, temporary county signs redirected neighborhood traffic away from my farm, restoring the quiet that had disappeared only days earlier. Residents watched with visible surprise as vehicles returned to alternate routes. Some began asking polite questions that the inspection team declined to answer until every document had been verified. Rebecca remained composed, but for the first time she stopped making public statements and instead spent much of the afternoon speaking privately with county staff and members of the Homeowners Association board. As the inspectors packed their equipment near sunset, the lead engineer gathered everyone for a brief announcement. He confirmed that the county had opened a formal administrative review into the history of the back entrance because critical approval records could not yet be verified. The final determination would be issued only after every historical file, engineering note, and archival record had been examined together. As I drove home along the now peaceful gravel road, my telephone vibrated with a message from Michael containing only one sentence. Another sealed archive box had just been located, and according to the inventory label, it contained the final correspondence exchanged before the entrance was ever supposed to receive permanent approval. I used to think the hardest part of protecting your property was proving you were right, but I discovered the real challenge was waiting while the truth slowly caught up with the paperwork. 2 days after the county inspection, the neighborhood felt completely different. The steady stream of vehicles had disappeared from my gravel road, leaving behind only the familiar sounds of birds, tractors, and the wind moving through the old oak trees. For the first time in over a week, I could stand outside my barn without a cloud of dust rolling across the pasture every few minutes. Yet I knew the story was far from over because the county had not released its final findings. Every answer seemed to uncover another unanswered question. Early that morning Michael called again, and this time there was something unusual in his voice. The sealed archive box had finally been opened under supervisor authorization. Inside were letters exchanged between county engineers, the original subdivision developer, and environmental reviewers during the final months before the neighborhood opened. Most of the correspondence discussed routine engineering issues, but one letter immediately stood apart. It stated that permanent approval for the back entrance would remain suspended until several drainage improvements and final field inspections had been completed. Attached to that letter was a checklist that matched the unsigned draft inspection packet Richard Lawson had shown me days earlier. Even more important, the final page contained no confirmation that those requirements had ever been satisfied. Instead, the correspondence simply stopped. That single discovery changed the investigation once again. The missing paperwork was no longer just an administrative mystery. It suggested the approval process may have ended before reaching its legal conclusion. Later that afternoon, the county released a brief public statement confirming that the administrative review remained active because newly discovered archival records required additional legal evaluation. The announcement spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. Residents who had previously accepted every assurance from the Homeowners Association now began asking careful questions during an emergency board meeting. Several homeowners politely requested copies of the approvals that had been referenced for weeks, but the board explained that the county currently possessed many of the original records. Rebecca Collins remained calm and encouraged everyone to wait for the official decision rather than speculate. Her confidence had changed, however. Instead of making firm declarations, she now spoke cautiously, choosing each word with obvious care. Watching from the back of the meeting room, I realized something else had changed. This was no longer a disagreement between one property owner and a homeowners association. The entire community wanted the same thing I wanted from the beginning, a clear answer supported by authentic records. After the meeting, several residents approached me privately and apologized for believing my road had been public access. They explained they had simply trusted the neighborhood information they had received and had never intended to interfere with my property. I appreciated their honesty because it reminded me that most people had acted in good faith based on what they believed was accurate. As I drove home beneath the fading evening sunlight, another unexpected message arrived from Michael. County attorneys had completed their first review of the newly discovered correspondence and requested every historical engineering file connected to the subdivision's original developer, because one unexplained signature appearing on an internal routing sheet did not belong to any county employee listed during that period, raising one final question that no one had considered before. If the county never issued the final approval, then who authorized the digital completion that had guided the neighborhood for so many years? I thought the county would need weeks to reach a decision, but the final stage arrived much sooner than anyone expected. 3 days after the public meeting, Michael called before I had even finished feeding the horses and asked whether I could come to the county administration building that afternoon. He could not explain everything over the telephone, but he said the legal review had reached a point where several findings would become part of the public record. By the time I arrived, the conference room was already filled with county attorneys, engineering officials, records specialists, transportation supervisors, members of the Homeowners Association board, and dozens of residents who simply wanted to understand what had really happened. Rebecca Collins sat quietly near the front of the room with a folder full of documents, looking far more reserved than she had during our first conversation on my farm. The county attorney opened the meeting by explaining that the review had focused on one question above all others: whether the neighborhood's back entrance had ever received the final authorization required under county procedures. Every document recovered from the archives had been examined alongside the digital records, engineering correspondence, inspection notes, and historical survey files. The conclusion surprised nearly everyone in the room. The county confirmed that it had found no completed record showing the required final inspection had ever been performed, and no authenticated approval could be located granting permanent status to the back entrance. Even more significant, the unexplained digital completion entry added years later could not be traced to any verified supporting document. The attorney carefully emphasized that the review did not accuse any current Homeowners Association board member of creating the historical discrepancy. Instead, the county simply could not recognize the entrance as fully approved without documentation that satisfied legal standards. That distinction mattered because it shifted the conversation away from blame and toward correction. Transportation officials then announced that the temporary restrictions imposed after the inspection would become permanent until any future approval process was completed under current county regulations. As a result, neighborhood traffic could no longer be directed across my private road, and the disputed back entrance would remain closed to normal community access. A quiet murmur spread through the room as residents realized the decision would permanently change how they entered and left the neighborhood. Several homeowners asked practical questions about future traffic patterns, emergency access, and possible improvements to the original entrance. County engineers explained that those issues would be addressed through a new planning process based entirely on verified records rather than assumptions carried forward from the past. I watched Rebecca stand and thank the county for completing a thorough review, acknowledging that the board would cooperate with every recommendation going forward. Her response surprised many people, including me. Instead of arguing against the findings, she accepted that the records spoke more clearly than opinions ever could. As the meeting concluded, several residents approached me once again, not to discuss the dispute itself but to thank me for insisting that the county examine the original documents instead of allowing uncertainty to continue. Driving home that evening, I realized the quiet road leading to my farm represented something much larger than private property. It represented the importance of preserving accurate public records for everyone. Just as I reached my front gate, my telephone buzzed with one final message from Michael. The county commissioners had scheduled one last announcement for the following morning because they intended to explain how the historical records would be permanently corrected, ensuring that the same mistake could never affect another property owner again. I never wanted to win against my neighbors. I only wanted the truth to stand where assumptions had been standing for far too long. The morning after the county announced its decision, I returned to the administration building for what officials described as the final public update. The room felt different this time. There was no uncertainty left, only the quiet anticipation of hearing how the county intended to prevent the same mistake from happening again. County commissioners opened the meeting by approving a formal correction to the historical property records. Every archived map, engineering reference, digital database entry, and public access record connected to the subdivision would now include updated documentation explaining that the back entrance had never received verified final approval under county procedures. They also directed the records department to link every future property search to the corrected file so that buyers, surveyors, engineers, title companies, and homeowners would all receive the same verified information. Watching that decision become part of the official record felt more meaningful than any personal apology could have been. Facts would now outlast opinions. After the meeting ended, Michael handed me certified copies of the updated records and smiled as he said that this had become one of the most thorough historical reviews the county had completed in years. He admitted that my decision to document everything instead of reacting emotionally had given investigators a clear timeline that allowed them to connect documents spread across multiple departments. Richard Lawson also attended the meeting and quietly thanked the commissioners for taking the archived engineering notes seriously instead of dismissing them because of their age. Several county employees gathered around him afterward, discussing ways to preserve older infrastructure records more carefully so future generations would not face the same confusion. Outside the building, I noticed Rebecca Collins speaking with several residents. When she walked toward me, there was no tension left between us. She acknowledged that she had trusted records presented to the Homeowners Association without realizing those records contained unresolved historical questions. I told her that I never believed the community itself had intended to create problems for my family. The real problem had been allowing incomplete information to become accepted as unquestioned fact. We shook hands not because every disagreement had disappeared, but because accurate records had finally replaced uncertainty. Over the following weeks the county removed the temporary traffic signs, restored the original entrance plans, updated online mapping references, and installed permanent notices preventing future routing through my private farm road without proper authorization. The quiet returned exactly as my grandfather would have remembered it. Horses grazed peacefully beside the old fence, delivery trucks stayed on public roads, and evenings once again ended with nothing louder than the wind moving across the pasture. Occasionally someone would stop and ask whether the long dispute had been worth the effort. I always gave the same answer. Protecting property was never just about fences, roads, or survey lines. It was about making certain that official records reflected the truth because those records shape decisions long after the people involved are gone. As I placed the final certified documents into the same family safe where my grandfather had stored the original deed decades earlier, I realized the greatest victory was not closing a disputed entrance, or ending unwanted traffic. It was knowing that anyone who opened those county records years from now would find one clear, consistent history supported by evidence instead of assumptions, and that quiet certainty was worth far more than winning any argument ever could have been.